In the fevered decades between the Great Wars, when the Western psyche stood fractured beneath the weight of industrial modernity and existential dread, Carl Gustav Jung encountered a symbol that would reshape his understanding of human consciousness itself. The serpent consuming its own tail, the ouroboros, appeared to him not as mythological decoration, but as a living diagram of the soul's secret architecture. This was not Jung's first encounter with the ancient symbol, of course. The ouroboros had haunted the margins of alchemical manuscripts, coiled around the world tree of Norse cosmology, and crowned the mystery cults of antiquity. Yet in Jung's hands, this primordial image underwent a transformation as radical as any alchemical transmutation. It became a map of the self's hidden coronation, the process by which consciousness claims its throne within the psyche. The genesis of Jung's investigation into what he would call the process of individuation cannot be separated from his own descent into what he termed his confrontation with the unconscious between 1913 and 1917. During this period, Jung experienced visions, engaged in active imagination, and documented his encounters with archetypal figures in what would later become known as the Red Book. It was here, in the crucible of his own psychological crisis, that Jung recognized the serpent's paradox. The creature that devours itself is simultaneously destroyer and nourisher, end and beginning, death and rebirth. The ouroboros became for Jung the perfect emblem of the self's capacity for self-transformation, a process that requires the conscious ego to surrender its primacy while simultaneously maintaining the awareness necessary to witness its own metamorphosis. This dual movement, surrender and witnessing, dissolution and integration, forms the Hermetic secret at the heart of Jungian psychology. It is a secret hidden in plain sight, encoded in the symbolic languages of alchemy, Gnosticism, and the mystery traditions. Jung recognized that these esoteric systems were not primitive attempts at chemistry or cosmology, but sophisticated maps of interior transformation. The serpent crown then represents the culmination of this interior work, the moment when consciousness recognizes itself as both king and kingdom, the sovereign power that rules over the totality of the psyche. Yet this coronation is no simple ascent to power. It demands a descent into the depths, an encounter with what Jung called the shadow, and a confrontation with the autonomous forces that dwell beneath the threshold of awareness. The quest for the serpent crown is nothing less than the quest for wholeness, a wholeness that can only be achieved through the integration of all that we have denied, repressed, and projected onto the world. Jung's doctrine of individuation stands as one of the most ambitious philosophical projects of the 20th century, an attempt to reconcile the empirical investigation of the psyche with the symbolic wisdom of the world's esoteric traditions. At its core, individuation describes the process by which a person becomes a psychological individual, that is, a separate, indivisible unity or whole. Yet this definition, clinical as it sounds, conceals depths that Jung spent decades exploring. Individuation is not the strengthening of the ego, the cultivation of a more robust sense of personal identity. Rather, it is the gradual relativization of the ego in relation to a greater center of psychic totality, what Jung called the self. The distinction between ego and self forms the axis upon which Jung's entire psychological edifice turns. The ego, in Jungian terms, is the center of conscious awareness, the I that experiences, decides, and acts in the world. It is necessary, functional, and inevitably limited. The self, by contrast, represents the totality of the psyche, encompassing both conscious and unconscious contents, the known and unknown dimensions of one's being. The self is not an achievement of consciousness, but its ground and goal, the alpha and omega of psychological development. In alchemical language, if the ego is the impure metal, the self is the gold that was always present within it, waiting to be revealed. This relationship between ego and self finds its clearest expression in the symbol of the ouroboros. The serpent's circular form, its head consuming its tail, depicts the self-reflexive nature of consciousness, the psyche's capacity to take itself as its own object. Yet the ouroboros is not merely circular, it is dynamic, a perpetual motion that generates and regenerates itself. Jung saw in this image a representation of what he called the circumambulation of the self, the spiraling path by which the ego gradually orbits closer to the psychic center. This movement is not linear progress, but a repeated return to core complexes, each time from a deeper level of awareness. The Hermetic dimension of Jung's work becomes explicit in his prolonged engagement with alchemical texts. Beginning in the 1920s and intensifying through the 1940s and 1950s, Jung studied hundreds of alchemical manuscripts, recognizing in them a symbolic language that paralleled the processes he observed in his patient's dreams and active imagination. The alchemical opus, the great work of transforming base metals into gold, was, Jung argued, a projected representation of the individuation process. The alchemist, believing he was working on physical matter, was unconsciously working on the transformation of his own psyche. The vessels, furnaces, and chemical operations described in alchemical texts were symbolic descriptions of interior states and psychological processes. Central to this alchemical psychology is the conjunctio oppositorum, the conjunction or union of opposites. For Jung, psychological health and spiritual maturity depend upon the integration of polarities, conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine, light and shadow, rational and instinctual. The Western mind, Jung argued, had developed the conscious, rational, masculine principle at the expense of its opposites, creating a dangerous imbalance that manifested in both individual neuroses and collective pathologies. The wars, totalitarian movements, and spiritual crises of modernity were, from Jung's perspective, symptoms of this psychic dissociation. The path forward lay not in the triumph of consciousness over the unconscious, but in their reconciliation, their marriage in the vessel of the individuating psyche. The serpent crown, in this context, represents the achievement of this union. When the serpent forms a circle, devouring its own tail, it creates a boundary that contains and defines a sacred space, the temenos in which transformation occurs. Within this protected precinct, opposites can encounter one another without mutual annihilation. The crown itself symbolizes sovereignty, but it is a sovereignty earned through submission to a power greater than the ego's will. In Hermetic philosophy, the microcosm reflects the macrocosm. The work performed in the individual soul participates in the cosmic order. Thus, the coronation of consciousness is simultaneously personal and transpersonal, a private achievement that nonetheless carries archetypal significance. Jung's philosophical rigor demanded that he ground these lofty symbolic interpretations in empirical observation. His method, what he called amplification, involved tracing the historical and cross-cultural manifestations of symbols that appeared in patients' dreams and fantasies. By demonstrating that these symbols recurred across times and cultures, Jung argued for the existence of a collective unconscious, a layer of the psyche that transcends personal experience and contains universal patterns he termed archetypes. The serpent, appearing in creation myths from Egypt to Mesoamerica, in the biblical Garden of Eden and the caduceus of Hermes, proved itself to be such an archetypal image. Its appearance in an individual's psychological material therefore connected that person to humanity's collective wisdom. Yet Jung was keenly aware of the dangers inherent in this work. The encounter with the unconscious could destabilize the ego, leading to inflation, possession by archetypal energies or psychotic episodes. The serpent, after all, is as much a symbol of poison as of healing, of temptation as of wisdom. The process of individuation requires what Jung called ethical confrontation, a sustained moral engagement with the materials that emerge from the unconscious. One cannot simply embrace the shadow or integrate the anima, animus through insight alone. The work demands lived experience, behavioral change, and often considerable suffering. The path of individuation unfolds not as a predetermined sequence, but as an organic process, unique to each individual, yet revealing recurrent archetypal patterns. Jung identified several crucial stages and encounters that characterize this interior work, each corresponding to both psychological development and alchemical operations. The confrontation with the persona. The journey begins with the recognition that the face we present to the world, what Jung termed the persona, is not identical with our true nature. The persona is a necessary social adaptation, a mask that allows us to function within collective structures. Yet when we identify completely with our social roles, professions, or public identities, we risk losing contact with the deeper currents of the psyche. The first movement toward individuation involves loosening the persona's grip, creating space for what has been excluded from our conscious self-concept to emerge. This often occurs through crisis: the successful executive who falls into inexplicable depression, the devoted parent who experiences rage toward their children, the respected scholar who dreams of chaos and obscenity. The persona cracks, and something other begins to seep through. The encounter with the shadow. What emerges first from beneath the persona is typically the shadow, those aspects of ourselves that we have deemed unacceptable, inferior, or incompatible with our conscious ideals. The shadow contains not only genuinely destructive impulses, but also undeveloped potentials, qualities we rejected because they didn't fit our self-image or meet social expectations. In alchemical terms, this is the nigredo, the blackening, the descent into the prima materia, the raw, chaotic substance from which transformation must begin. The shadow appears in dreams as criminals, enemies, or repulsive figures of the same sex as the dreamer. It appears in waking life through projection. We see our own rejected qualities in others, responding with disproportionate judgment or fascination. The work with the shadow demands rigorous self-honesty. It requires that we withdraw our projections and acknowledge this capacity for cruelty, this pettiness, this hunger. It lives in me. Yet this acknowledgement must not collapse into self-condemnation or nihilistic embrace of destructiveness. The integration of the shadow means recognizing these qualities as part of oneself while choosing consciously how to relate to them. The murderous rage need not lead to murder, but neither can it be simply repressed. It must be understood, perhaps redirected into passion for justice or creative destruction of obsolete structures. Jung observed that individuals who successfully integrate substantial portions of their shadow often undergo noticeable changes in presence and character. They become more three-dimensional, less predictable, more genuinely ethical because their ethics are chosen rather than merely internalized from external authorities. They acquire what Jung called psychological weight, a groundedness that comes from acknowledging the full spectrum of human possibility within oneself. The encounter with the contra-sexual archetype. Following the shadow work, or often concurrent with it, comes the encounter with what Jung termed the anima in men, or animus in women. These figures represent the contra-sexual aspects of the psyche, the interior other that bridges consciousness and the deeper unconscious. The anima appears in a man's dreams and fantasies as feminine figures ranging from seductress to spiritual guide, from witch to wise woman. The animus appears to women as masculine figures, often plural, a council of judges or advisors, representing opinions, convictions, and logos-based thinking. These contra-sexual figures mediate between the ego and the collective unconscious, but they do so in ways that can be disruptive or even dangerous. An unintegrated anima can possess a man, rendering him moody, sentimental, or caught in destructive relationships with actual women onto whom he projects his interior feminine. An unintegrated animus can possess a woman, manifesting as dogmatic opinions, harsh judgments, or attraction to men who embody her unconscious masculine. The relationship with these inner figures must evolve through stages. Jung described 4 developmental levels for the anima, from the purely biological and instinctual, Eve, through the romantic and aesthetic, Helen, to the spiritual and religious, Mary, and finally to the wisdom figure, Sophia. Similar progressions characterize the animus. This development occurs not through willpower, but through sustained attention to how these figures appear in dreams, active imagination, and the patterns of one's relationships. The goal is not to eliminate the contra-sexual other, but to establish a conscious relationship with it, allowing it to serve its proper function as guide to the deeper psyche, rather than remaining an autonomous complex that hijacks consciousness. The approach to the self. As the work with shadow, anima, animus, and other archetypal figures progresses, dreams and active imagination begin to produce symbols of totality and wholeness. Mandalas appear, circles, squares, quaternity structures that depict a center and its relationship to a circumference. The self announces itself through such symbols, though never fully or finally. The self, remember, is not an object to be grasped, but the ground and totality of the psyche, the axis around which consciousness revolves. In alchemical symbolism, this stage corresponds to the appearance of the lapis philosophorum, the philosopher's stone, or the birth of the divine child, the filius philosophorum. These images represent the product of the conjunction of opposites, the union of conscious and unconscious, solar and lunar, sulfur and mercury. Jung recognized that these symbols often had a numinous quality for those who encountered them. Patients would weep or experience profound shifts in perspective upon confronting certain dream images or synchronistic events. The approach to the self involves what Jung called circumambulation, a spiraling movement around the psychic center. Each revolution brings new material into consciousness, reveals new aspects of the shadow, new dimensions of the anima, animus. The process appears endless because the self, as the totality of the psyche, always exceeds what consciousness can grasp. Yet this very excess is life-giving. It prevents the premature closure of development, the false certainty that one has arrived. The ordeal of opposites. Perhaps the most difficult phase of individuation involves the sustained tension of holding opposites in consciousness without premature resolution. Jung called this the conjunctio, the union of opposites, and it represents the essential alchemical work. The psyche naturally seeks to resolve tension through repression, favoring one pole and suppressing the other, or through identification, collapsing the tension by identifying wholly with one side. The individuating person must learn to tolerate the conflict of opposites, the simultaneous pull toward relationship and solitude, the conflict between personal desire and collective responsibility, the tension between what one is and what one might become. This ordeal is represented in alchemy by the image of the hermaphrodite or rebis, the double-natured being that combines masculine and feminine, sun and moon, within a single form. It appears in mythology as the divine marriage, the hieros gamos, where god and goddess, king and queen, unite to produce the renewed world. Psychologically, it manifests as the ability to hold increasingly complex paradoxes, to be both strong and vulnerable, certain and doubtful, individual and connected to the whole. Jung observed that those who successfully navigate this phase often develop a capacity for what he called symbolic living. They cease to interpret life's events merely in terms of personal psychology or social dynamics, and begin to perceive the archetypal dimensions of experience. Losses become descents, achievements become ascents, relationships become encounters with the divine other. This is not a regression into primitive thinking, but an expansion of consciousness that includes both rational understanding and symbolic perception. The revelation of the self. In rare moments through dreams, visions, or experiences in waking life, individuals may encounter direct manifestations of the self. These experiences carry overwhelming numinosity, a sense of standing before something absolutely other, yet profoundly intimate. Jung's own encounter with such material, documented in the Red Book, included visions of gods, dialogues with archetypal figures, and experiences of cosmic significance. He was careful to note that such experiences, while transformative, also carry the risk of inflation, the ego's tendency to identify with archetypal material, leading to grandiosity or psychotic break. The self reveals itself not as a static entity, but as a process, a continual self-creation of the psyche. The ouroboros captures this perfectly. The serpent does not simply exist in circular form, but actively creates that form through the act of self-consumption. Similarly, the self is not a given, but an achievement, not a substance, but a relationship between consciousness and the unconscious ground from which it emerges. No examination of Jung's individuation process can evade the terror at its heart, the confrontation with what he called the absolute destruction necessary for rebirth. This is not the fashionable darkness of aesthetic melancholy, but the genuine disintegration of the psychic structures upon which identity and meaning depend. Jung knew this territory intimately, having navigated his own crisis during the composition of the Red Book. The encounter with the unconscious, when pursued with genuine rigor, inevitably leads to a threshold where the ego must face its own inadequacy, its smallness before the vast autonomous forces that move through the psyche. The crisis typically arrives when the individual has progressed far enough in the work that old defensive structures begin to fail, but not yet far enough to have established new, more comprehensive patterns of meaning. The persona has been questioned, the shadow partially acknowledged, the contra-sexual archetype engaged, and precisely at this point, chaos erupts. Dreams become more intense, sometimes nightmarish. Synchronicities multiply to an uncanny degree. The individual may experience a dissolution of the barriers between inner and outer, self and world. In psychiatric terms, this resembles psychotic process. In mystical terms, it is the dark night of the soul. Jung distinguished carefully between psychotic breakdown and the initiatory crisis of individuation, though he acknowledged the two could be phenomenologically similar. The crucial difference lies in whether the ego maintains sufficient strength to witness the process without complete identification with unconscious contents. The psychotic becomes the archetype, becomes Christ or Satan, the persecuted one or the chosen savior. The individuating person experiences the archetype as a power that moves through them, recognizing it as both intimately their own and utterly beyond their control. This phase corresponds to the alchemical mortificatio or putrefactio, the death and putrefaction that must precede renewal. The alchemists spoke of killing the king, dissolving the metals in corrosive acids, the blackening and rotting of matter in the sealed vessel. These operations described psychic states of dissolution, the death of cherished beliefs, the collapse of world views, the decay of relationships and roles that once provided meaning. What is being dissolved, ultimately, is the ego's fantasy of sovereignty, its belief that it stands at the center of psychic life and controls the flow of events. The suffering inherent in this process cannot be overstated or romanticized. Jung's patients during this phase often experienced profound depressions, existential despair, somatic symptoms, and relationship ruptures. Some abandoned the work, seeking refuge in conventional religious faith, political ideology, or various forms of distraction and numbing. Those who continued reported feeling haunted, possessed, torn between worlds. The challenge was to neither flee back to the safety of unconsciousness nor plunge forward into identification with archetypal forces, but to maintain what Jung called the tension of opposites, standing between known and unknown, human and divine, ego and self. Jung recognized that traditional religious and initiatory practices had provided containers for such experiences. The vision quest, the spiritual retreat, the mystical path guided by experienced teachers. Modernity had largely abandoned these structures without replacing them with adequate psychological frameworks. Thus, individuals faced these initiatory crises alone, or worse, interpreted them through the reductive lens of psychiatric pathology. Jung's depth psychology offered a new language for these experiences, a way to understand them as potentially meaningful rather than merely symptomatic. Yet language and understanding, while helpful, do not eliminate suffering. They do not make the encounter with the shadow less disturbing or the dissolution of ego structures less disorienting. What they provide is context, a map that suggests the territory, while terrifying, can be crossed. The crisis becomes bearable when understood as passage rather than permanent condition, as necessary dissolution rather than meaningless breakdown. The ethical dimension of this crisis deserves emphasis. As the ego's control loosens, previously repressed instinctual energies surge into consciousness. Individuals may experience intensified sexual and aggressive drives, powerful urges toward transgression, attraction to what was formerly taboo. The work demands conscious ethical choice at precisely the moment when the foundations of conscience have been called into question. How does one act ethically when the internalized moral authorities have been recognized as parental and cultural complexes rather than absolute truth? Jung's answer involved the development of what he called ethical responsibility, not obedience to external law, but conscious accountability for one's choices and their consequences. The crisis also involves mourning. Mourning for the simpler self one once believed oneself to be. Mourning for lost innocence. Mourning for the recognition that consciousness brings suffering. There is grief in acknowledging one's shadow, in recognizing the harm one has caused or the potential one has squandered. There is sorrow in the realization that increased consciousness does not bring unambiguous happiness, but rather deeper participation in the human condition with all its tragedy and ambiguity. What emerges from this crucible is not a perfected self, but a more whole one, scarred, complex, capable of holding contradiction. Jung termed this achievement psychological birth, the moment when the individual becomes truly themselves, no longer simply the product of parental and cultural conditioning, but a unique expression of human possibility. Yet this birth is not a single event, but an ongoing process, a continual choosing of consciousness over comfortable unconsciousness. The integrated personality displays several characteristics that mark successful individuation. First, there is a noticeable decrease in projection. Having recognized substantial portions of the shadow, anima, animus, and other archetypal contents as belonging to oneself, the individual relates to others more directly, less burdened by unconscious expectations and attributions. Relationships become more genuine because they are based on seeing the other as they are, rather than as carriers of one's own unconscious material. Second, there emerges what Jung called symbolic attitude, the capacity to perceive the archetypal dimension of ordinary experience. Birth becomes nativity, death becomes transformation, conflict becomes the clash of opposites seeking resolution. This is not a rejection of concrete reality, but an enrichment of it, a double vision that sees both the immediate and the eternal, the personal and the archetypal. Life acquires depth and resonance without losing its particularity. Third, the individuated person develops a relationship with the self that provides an inner authority, transcending collective opinion and personal preference. This does not mean arrogant certainty, but rather a capacity to consult an interior wisdom that integrates conscious understanding, unconscious insight, and the accumulated experience encoded in archetypal structures. In moments of genuine perplexity, such individuals can turn inward, and through dreams, active imagination, or careful attention to synchronistic events, receive guidance that feels both surprising and deeply right. The serpent crown, as symbol of this achievement, represents consciousness that has undergone death and renewal, that has been broken down and reconstituted in a form that includes what was previously excluded. The crown signifies sovereignty, not the ego's inflation, but the self's rightful rule over the totality of the psyche. The individual wearing this crown has earned it through descent and ascent, through the courage to face the unconscious and the discipline to integrate what was found there. Yet Jung insisted on a crucial point. Individuation does not remove one from life, but deepens one's participation in it. The goal is not transcendence of the human condition, but fuller inhabitation of it. The individuated person remains subject to suffering, error, and limitation, but relates to these conditions differently. They become, in Jung's phrase, truly themselves, which means both more individual and more universal, more particular and more archetypal. The integration Jung described bears little resemblance to the self-help notion of becoming your best self. It involves no simple optimization of personality, but rather the acceptance of irreducible complexity, the embrace of paradox, the willingness to be a question rather than an answer. The new self that emerges is larger, darker, and stranger than the ego that began the journey. It contains multitudes, not through fragmentation, but through conscious relationship with the various subpersonalities, complexes, and archetypal energies that constitute the full psyche. This achievement carries social implications Jung believed essential to address. He argued that the renewal of culture depends upon the individuation of its members. Unconscious masses, driven by unrecognized archetypal forces, become vulnerable to collective possession, by political movements, by ideologies, by the charismatic leaders who embody projected unconscious contents. Only individuals who have done the work of self-knowledge can resist such possession, can think and choose for themselves while remaining connected to the collective. The coronation of consciousness, then, is simultaneously a personal and collective achievement. Each individual who undertakes the work contributes to the evolution of consciousness itself, adding their hard-won insights to the collective wisdom of humanity. This is the Hermetic secret Jung spent his life articulating, that the great work of transforming lead into gold, of discovering the philosopher's stone, of achieving the conjunctio oppositorum, occurs not in alchemical laboratories, but in the vessel of the individuating psyche, and that this interior work has exterior consequences, rippling outward to touch family, community, culture, and perhaps the collective unconscious itself. The gold you seek is not in the crucible, but in the will that kindles the fire, and that fire once lit reveals the crown was always yours to claim.